stimulating, interesting, challenging, and I hope a really participating day. So I'm looking forward to more, not just listening, but adding in your own kinds of thoughts and discussions. This is our fourth annual conference. And as you can see from what you've got in front of you, we're doing it a little bit differently this year because we've had some feedback about having speaker after speaker. So we thought this time we would have some breakout groups, so you're going to be in small groups. You've got lists, I hope you know where you're going. Yes? If not, you can see on the doors where you're going to be going. So again, that's a time when you can participate very fully and bring your own thoughts to bear on the range of topics that we've got today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. For those who don't know, the loos are downstairs in the basement. The usual thing, we're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if the fire bell does go off, you just go outside through those main doors outside the foyer. I'd like to just alert any of you that don't know that we have another big event coming in March, where we have the Klein-Winnicott conference that's going to bring Bob Hinchelwood and Jan Albrand's work together. They've both done considerable work on the language and concepts used by Klein-Winnicott. So that's going to be another very interesting day, which I'd like to invite you all to I think that's really all I have to say. I'm not going to try and introduce the conference because there's more than enough coming in terms of the topics involved. I'll hand over to Karl, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Just sample them. But just to mention, just a few of them, just to begin. Just taking books alone. The Good Society in the Inner World, Reason and Non-Reason, Psychoanalysis, Science and Politics, Psychoanalytic Sociology, Mirror to Nature, Psychoanalysis and Society, Narratives of Love and Loss, Studies of Modern Creation, then the editorial boards. Yes?
Can't hear you, I'm sorry. Thank you. Can't hear you.
Really?
Yes.
Such a small room as well. I don't think I'll review one of the things I just said. I mentioned several of Michael's publications, single-authored books, several works in collaboration with his wife, Margaret, edited collections, countless journal articles, membership of professional associations. He was the winner of the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis Gravita Award in 2002 for contributions to psychoanalysis. It goes on and on and on. So I'll just mention them almost in passing in order to get to the point I'd like to make, which is what an occasion like this offers us. And I was thinking when our paths first crossed, I think it goes back to about 1984 with the foundation of Free Association, which has been a very significant journal in psychoanalysis, culture, and politics for many years. And then with a very successful series of conferences sponsored jointly by the University of East London, where Michael was professor of sociology, and Free Association, called Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere. I think we had about 10 years of these conferences, always very well attended and very stimulating. They ramified into other works as these things happen. And then, very recently, we set up a series of workshops on trying to understand what one could possibly mean by psychosocial. And sure enough, Michael was back with us. And in the years in between, there have been so many occasions where his presence has been a very valuable and fertile contribution. So what I wanted to just really finish by saying, because he more or less introduces himself, is that an occasion like this offers a chance to appreciate and say thank you to somebody who's been so important to the whole area, not just of psychoanalysis, but to psychoanalysis in its engagements in every form of social, cultural, and political life. And because just listing his publications doesn't say that, a personal occasion like this gives us a chance to say thank you and to say how much we look forward to his contribution speaking with him today. And just one point about how he would like to conduct this plenary session is that when he finishes, his aim is to say nothing until once 5 minutes at the end, in order to avoid the sort of question answer, mini talk and so on, but to get a discussion going. So I'll hand over to
Well, thank you very much, Karl, for that very kind introduction. Very nice to be here in Essex again. Can everybody hear? My talk is called Love and Hate in the Revolutionary Unconscious. The unconscious is a part of the mind where, it is said, the limits of neither time, space, nor logic exist. It is, however, a cauldron of desires, capable of boiling over into passionate action in certain circumstances. Following Freud, we can say that these passions and desires are of two major kinds. The first, those dominated by pleasure and love, and the second, by hatred and pain. For Sigmund Freud, with his model of the mind divided between life and death instincts, and for Melanie Klein, who formulated this struggle as also being between the emotions of love and hate, these opposed passions are in permanent conflict for ascendancy. We might suppose that the revolutionary unconscious, that's to say that part of the unconscious mind that's drawn, in conditions of oppression or stasis, to relate in a militant, challenging way to external realities, is similarly divided in its orientations and desires. The principal external realities of this kind I'm going to be considering today are political ones, the behaviours of governments, states and economic systems. But revolutionary impulses are also directed in more local or partial ways. We talk of revolutions in the arts, modernism, in science and technology, the Industrial Revolution, in sexual life. It seems likely that these various manifestations connect in similar ways to unconscious desires. They emerge following the breakdown of repression or stasis. Of course, there are theoretical issues involved in referring to the unconscious in these political and unconscious connections, when the unconscious has been primarily useful as a concept in the context of clinical psychoanalysis. To this degree, the term revolutionary unconscious, which you've adopted for this conference, was to me an unexpected one. But let's put this theoretical issue on one side for the time being. The dual and conflicted aspect of unconscious mental life throws light on what we've learned, rather painfully to understand, as the dual and conflicted life of political revolutions. These are often motivated by intense hopes and beliefs in possibilities of transformation, shared by a large population, often as a consequence of very rapid transmissions of feeling. The process that Deleuze wrote about in terms of quantum flows, lines of flight and deterritorialization are rapid transmissions of this kind. These aspirations often have their origin in the most valued aspects of present, remembered or imagined existences. In the revolutionary mind, these are projected into the future as being capable of realization, if only the repressive or stupid obstacles to change can be removed or destroyed. Revolutions in the past have encompassed experiences and feelings of joy and excitement, great liberations of energy and creativity, as forces of oppression or indifference are pushed aside. Here is William Wordsworth remembering the earlier days of the French Revolution. "'Twas in truth an hour of universal ferment, mildest men were agitated, and commotion, strife of passion and opinion filled the walls of peaceful houses with unique sounds. The soil of common life was at that time too hot to tread upon. And, O pleasant exercise of hope and joy! For mighty were the auxiliars which then stood upon our side, we who were strong in love. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Oh, times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance." And here's George Orwell writing about Catalonia in 1936. "I had come to Spain with some notion of writing newspaper articles, but I joined the militia almost immediately, because at that time and in that atmosphere it seemed the only conceivable thing to do. The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia, and the revolution was still in full swing. To anyone who'd been there since the beginning, it probably seemed, even in December or January, that the revolutionary period was ending. But when one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I'd ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with red flags or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivised. Even the bootblacks had been collectivised and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shopwalkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said senor or don or even usted. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou, and said salud instead of buenos dias. Tipping had been forbidden by law since the time of Primo de Rivera. Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from a hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. There were no private motor cars, they'd all been commandeered, and all the trams and taxis and much of the other transport was painted red and black. The revolutionary posters were everywhere, flaming from the walls in clean reds and blues that made the few remaining advertisements look like daubs of mud. Down the Ramblas, the wide central artery of the town, where crowds of people streamed constantly to and fro, the loudspeakers were bellowing revolutionary songs all day and far into the night. And it was the aspect of the crowds that was the queerest thing of all. In outward appearance, it was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes or blue overalls or some variant of a militia uniform. All this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I did not understand. In some ways, I did not even like it, but I recognised it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. There was also the explosion of euphoria in Paris and other cities in 1968 and 1969. Actually, I recall at the University of Essex, quite a century ago, in which many things which had not until then been imagined or thought of now seem to be possible. However, the most intense moment of the 1968 events in Britain was probably the demonstration against the Vietnam War in March, with its march on the American embassy in Grosvenor Square, which ended in violence. We know that all of these revolutions had a negative aspect too. Wordsworth and Orwell both went on, in the work cited above, to describe their disenchantment with what they later observed of these two revolutions. Even though in the earlier phases of challenge to ancien regime, hope and new kinds of solidarities seem to dominate life, the reality is that established orders nearly always resist being pushed aside. They fight to hold on to their powers and privileges, often with great violence and brutality. In the case of France, Russia and Spain, calling on armed aid from outside powers. In the conflicts which follow, hatreds which were relatively muted in the first phases of challenge assume a much larger place, often leading to extremes of violence. The revolutionary crowd changes its mood when its members are being trampled, shot at or taken away to be killed. We've seen something like this natural succession of protest movements taking place in some of the episodes of the Arab Spring, with different outcomes in the different nations. Should the struggle between revolutionaries and the forces defending the status quo become a total one, in which the actual survival of each side comes to be at stake, anxieties of the most primitive kinds are evoked. Each side dreads the consequences of its possible defeat, because it feels it knows its enemy all too well, and perhaps because it fears retribution for harm it has itself caused. Victor Serge, writing in Memoirs of a Revolutionary, about the civil war which followed the Bolshevik Revolution, describes how, with every defeat of the Red Armies, the power of the Cheka, the revolution's secret police, grew greater and more cruel. The standards of humanity that Serge wished the revolution to maintain became eroded, despite his own efforts and what he believed to be the good intention of the Bolshevik leaders. Both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces become dominated in that situation by what Melanie Klein termed the paranoid schizoid position, a state of mind in which all virtue is attributed to the self, or one's own side, and all evil to the enemy. In this state of mind, the capacity for rational thought and discrimination is undermined. Reality is distorted, and black myth and propaganda take its place. This is the common condition of war, and especially of total war. And in reality, revolutions, including both the French and the Bolshevik examples, often culminated in a condition of pretty total war. This state of affairs is in contrast to the more depressive states of mind, which may dominate the more hopeful early stages of revolutionary struggle. At this point, it's imagined that everyone, or at least nearly everyone, will benefit from radical change. Respect may still be accorded to principles and institutions which either hold continuing value from the past, for example established legal procedures, or which are upheld because of their universal application, concepts of human rights, for example, which may still be extended to opponents and enemies, as Serge wished to happen in the context of the Russian Revolution. The three writers quoted, Wordsworth, Orwell and Serge, all initially hopeful about the revolutions which they'd witnessed and supported, each became critical or disillusioned about their later stages. This happened in different ways. Wordsworth expressed a deep sense of loss and disappointment, which is worked out in some detail in the Prelude. He and Coleridge retired to rural quietude, subsequently to become conservatives. Orwell becomes indignant and angry, placing the blame for the failure of the revolutionary movement on some of its agents, the communists, whom he accused of betraying its values. Orwell subsequently found new locations in which to place both his hope and his loyalties, his libidinal unconscious, we might call this, and his more negative emotions, his destructive unconscious. These are, on the one hand, the virtues of ordinary English people that he evoked in his patriotic but also socialist wartime writings, and on the other hand, the evils of totalitarian oppression of both Nazi and Bolshevik varieties that figure in allegorical form in Animal Farm of 1984. Victor Serge tried hard to hold on to a balanced, albeit tragic view of his experience. He remained loyal to the Bolshevik Revolution, while insisting on recording, almost from its beginning, its descent into what he really is describing as a totalitarian nightmare. The overthrow of the apartheid regime in South Africa, surely a revolution of a kind, followed an unusual path in certain respects, in regard to the dialectic of its depressive and paranoid schizoid elements. This is because of the way in which the apartheid regime was defeated, with a relatively containing process of negotiation and compromise taking place amidst the considerable violence. The compromise meant that the transfer of political powers was made to the black majority, while the economic privileges of the white minority were, at the same time, preserved. It's worth remembering the seemingly miraculous quality of this transition in its earlier years. The paranoid schizoid antagonisms and anxieties of the apartheid system and the mass struggle against it culminated not in its violent overthrow and in a cataclysm of retribution by black people or scorched earth destruction by whites, though at one point that outcome seemed possible, but in the non-racialized and inclusionary politics of Mandela and his ANC comrades. Two cultures of universalism, that of the South African Communist Party and of the Anglican Church led by Archbishop Tutu, seem to have come together in making possible this peaceful resolution. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought to give a symbolic expression to this depressive outcome through its central idea that if the crimes of the past could be publicly acknowledged, antagonisms might be defused and a new beginning become possible. This was, self-evidently, a very imperfect process, though nonetheless a significant one. The victims who came forward to the TRC appeared to be less psychologically damaged by their experiences than the perpetrators of the crimes that were described, and more capable of recovery from them. The hatred and violence that had been excluded from the formal political process continued to manifest itself in the wider society, for example, in exceptionally high levels of violent crime. Furthermore, the acknowledgement of gross injustice to the majority black population, signified by the change of political regime, did not extend to rapid change in the economic system of the country, with consequences that have recently become manifest in the violent disputes in the mining industry. Slavoj Žižek has provided an astute analysis of the pattern which has shaped the revolutions against the state socialist regimes of Eastern Europe, which is relevant also to other transitions of this kind, such as that which is taking place in Egypt. He's noted that the movements which provide the energy and aspiration to make the revolutions are rarely the agencies which retain power after the old regimes have been displaced. The most courageous among those who resist oppression are always in a minority, and when a form of representative politics is instituted, these idealists may fail to secure majority support. Zizek also noticed, in the context of the East European revolutions, the ambiguous role taken by Western liberals. While the struggle against the regime is going on, the idealists leading it receive great moral support from the capitalist world, in part, Zizek suggests, as a projective surrogate for an idealism now absent from its own practices, and also because any stick with which to beat the enemy of liberalism is welcome. But once the old regime is removed, the idealists have not much further value for the politicians of the West, and considerations of realpolitik and economic advantage resume their usual priority. In East Europe, and indeed in Russia, it was often people who retained belief in the latent ideals of communism itself who had led resistance to its decayed authoritarian regimes. There had been significant movements of reform within these systems, with reforming governments even briefly taking power in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, before these were put down by Soviet intervention. Gorbachev was a reformed communist. He declined to sustain the regimes of the East European system through the military force on which they come to depend, and aimed for the internal renewal of the communist system through his program of glasnost, freedom of speech, and open accountability. But while his liberalism and that of other East European reformers was enthusiastically welcomed in the West during the years of crisis of these regimes, the West declined to support the evolution which these reformers wanted, and instead furthered the total dissolution of the state socialist system after 1989. Thus, Bush, Kohl and Thatcher were able to achieve a virtual conquest without firing a shot. Zizek's own feeling for paradoxes, his zest for pointing out that things are so often just the opposite of what they are made to seem, may be the result of his own close encounters with these opposed systems, he coming from Slovenia. He observes that both of them base their legitimacy on ideals which they consistently fail to respect, and indeed often betray. Each of these systems have been experts in ideological hypocrisy. The contemporary crisis of capitalism and liquid modernity. One of the inspirations for this seminar, it appears, is the crisis now being experienced by Western capitalism itself. This became manifest in the credit crunch of 2007-2008, and in the protracted recession which has followed it. Elements of the crisis include the extreme difficulties now being experienced within the European Union, especially in its peripheral southern nations, the major transfer of economic power to the newly emerging economies of China and Brazil and so on, which is taking place, and not least the threat of climatic catastrophe which now hovers over the entire planet, with its increasingly frequent harbingers such as Hurricane Sandy a couple of weeks ago. It seems a good idea to try to bring psychoanalytic thinking about political realities together with these very challenging phenomena of our day. The question must be, does the idea of a revolutionary unconscious have any relevance in this situation? And if so, what might this be? One way of approaching these questions might be via Zygmunt Bauman's re-examination and modern restatement of the argument of Freud's civilization and its discontents. Freud's great text, Bauman points out, described an era in which life was dominated by repression. Civilization was a system of social and cultural practices whose function, Freud said, was to contain conflicting unconscious desires, emanating from both the life and the death instincts. It was a precarious system whose discontents, we should remember at the time when Freud was writing, 1929, were about to explode it into pieces. We might add that in the 1920s the repressive structures about which Freud was writing were already beginning to disintegrate, under the pressures of democracy, revolution, modernisms of various kinds, and the disorganisations brought about by war. The diffusion of psychotic ideas were both a symptom and a causal agent in this process of de-repression. In the consumer society which Bauman has termed liquid modernity, the dominant psychosocial structures are very different from those of Freud's time. Whereas there was once an excess of repression, there is now perhaps too little. In the former situation, the widespread unconscious demand was for greater freedom. In the present, Bauman suggests it's for greater security. Hence, as he points out, the rituals of security tests and risk assessments which surround us all. Whereas capitalism formerly devoted to accumulation, demanding abstinence and the repression of desires, one dependent on mass consumption demands that desires be endlessly stimulated, the very opposite of abstinence. A rampant spirit of individualism and hedonism weakens and dissolves social bonds of all kinds. Bauman's argument has affinities with Herbert Marcuse's late Frankfurt School thesis of the 1960s, in which he also analysed the psychological consequences of a shift from a system dominated by the needs of capital accumulation to one dependent on the stimulation of desires. In his book Soviet Marxism, Marcuse noted the similarity between the puritanical culture of Russia during the period of forced industrialization and early industrial society in the West. Marcuse described the contemporary situation as an inauthentic liberation. Repressive sublimation was his term for it. He held that desires and appetites, unhinged from context of human relationships, are liable to provide very shallow satisfactions and may indeed lead to the collapse of differences and discrimination between the life-giving and the perverse. Bauman's description of the decay of social solidarities and the emergence of outcasts and nomads as a residual byproduct of the system, its human waste products, he says, gives further meaning to Marcuse's critique. Bauman recently developed this argument to an audience assembled by the British Psychological Society, giving emphasis to sexual repression in that context. How has it come about, he asked, that the society which had once been phobic about masturbation in children, and which encouraged its suppression by parents, is now instead preoccupied mainly with the sexual molestation of children by grown-ups, and is extremely anxious to keep dangerous adults away from them. This concern can be taken to ridiculous lengths, for example requiring police checks of anyone intending to work in the vicinity of children, even if they have an impeccable professional record of decades of such work, but happen to be changing their employers. The recent incident of the maths teacher who went off to France with a 15-year-old female pupil, and now the expanding Jimmy Savile scandal and the further scandals of North Wales children's homes, gave graphic evidence in the days after Bauman's talk of how close to the nerve he was. He suggested that the broader latent effect of molestation anxiety was to inhibit relationships between older and younger generations. The consequence, he suggested, was that children are increasingly left to bring themselves up with computers, smartphones and social media as substitutes for close contact with parents and other adults. And one can also mention the importance of gangs as a substitute for more developmental kinds of relationship. How far this is an accurate picture of prevailing child-parent relations, I'm in no position to say. But there is no doubt that the life stage of adolescence, that mainly peer group related stage of life, that lies between a family of origin and a family of procreation, has become enormously extended in recent generations. It seems to have grown in that time from a life space of nearly 0 to at least 10 years, even an indefinite period in some instances. Rock stars go on until they're 70. It's also the case that those social institutions, colleges and universities, apprenticeships and other pathways into employment, whose function is to establish a developmental relationship with the next generation, are becoming weakened in their capacity to perform this role. Youth unemployment is one symptom of a potentially serious social crisis. In more extreme contexts, such as African countries ravaged by civil wars and massacres, intergenerational disruption has as a consequence, or one consequence, the recruitment of adolescent and even child soldiers. One can incidentally see in the writings of these direct or indecent descendants of the Frankfurt schools of sociological Freudians a hidden nostalgia for forms of traditional authority which Freud took for granted as solid features of his world, even as he sought to understand the harms which they caused. The conditions of modern dissent. It seems clear that the contemporary crisis of capitalism signifies a decline in material expectations, at least for the populations of the affluent West, compared with the period that began with the New Deal, post-Second War Reconstruction, and the period of consumer capitalist boom that followed. It appears that the prosperity of the past decade or so, up until the banking crisis, was in part, however, an illusion, concealing deep underlying problems. These problems include a decline in innovation and productivity, market shrinking because of declining incomes among middle and low-income groups, the saturation of consumer demand, and falling birth rates in the West. And there are the larger problems already referred to, such as the West's impending loss of hegemony in the world, and the looming problems of climate change, and perhaps of overpopulation and resource scarcity. Our conference organisers have implicitly posed the question of whether a revolutionary political response to these situations is to be expected or hoped for. A distinction should be made between social conditions in which life expectations are improving and those in which they are becoming worse. In the former, desires and hopes usually grow, as does a sense of agency and capability. The revolutionary moment can crystallise such sentiments and states of mind in a creative way, although usually such moments emerge from previous experiences which have already given rise to hopefulness. It's noteworthy that many of the radicals of the civil rights movement in the United States and of 1968 were relatively privileged children of the New Deal, demanding to see universalised the values which they had imbibed during their relatively fortunate upbringing. Similarly, the revolutionaries of 1789 sought to realise ideas which were first formulated during the Enlightenment. Elements of reparative guilt are often part of this radical structure of feeling, since it comes to feel intolerable, especially for those who still feel loyalty to their own modest origins, that their good fortune is not being shared with everyone. The early Wordsworth committed in his poetry to affirming the dignity of humble country people, but also himself privileged as a Cambridge student with freedom to travel to France and Italy, may in this respect be an ancestor of modern radicals. Consider by contrast the experience of declining conditions of life, of downward rather than upward mobility, when expectations become diminished. Rather than the growth of hope and desire, there is then the spread of disappointment and depression. The central question is not how can new pleasures and satisfactions be shared and others included in them, but rather how can we defend what we have left? And who can be blamed for our losses and misfortunes? The experience of rising expectations may have as one of its concomitants what Kleinians termed impressive and reparative states of mind. By contrast, diminishing expectations are incubators of paranoid schizoid states. The most extreme instance of this was the onset of Nazism, an outcome of a malign combination of national defeat, humiliation by the victorious powers, economic collapse and disorganisation, twice over, hyperinflation followed by large-scale unemployment, and bitter and unrestrained class conflict. Nowhere has there ever been a purer case of the paranoid schizoid state of mind, dominated by irrational and ultimately psychotic fantasies of racial purity and impurity, and with an entire society organised for endless war against its enemies. This system gave expression to a revolutionary unconsciousness of a certain kind. Revolutionary states of mind dominated by hatred, often revolutionaries of the extreme right, though not always, should not be excluded from this discussion. The emergence of the cosmetically named Golden Dawn in contemporary Greece, a neo-Nazi formation which holds immigrants responsible for Greece's disaster and builds its momentum from attacking them, just as the Nazis did in pre-1933 Germany, reminds us that this spectre has not wholly disappeared from Europe. The economic conditions in other European countries, notably Spain, but also potentially Italy and Portugal, are within possible sight of that of Greece, though without as yet an equivalently vicious political reaction. Revolution has a distinct meaning and indeed necessity in societies where regimes maintain their power by armed force and where they exclude the possibility of change by peaceful means. In those circumstances, whether it be authoritarian government or colonial rule, the ruling system has to be displaced, and usually by force, if development is to happen. This is not the state of affairs of democratic capitalist societies, even if their democratic practices may in reality be quite compromised, as they are, for example, in the United States, where the power of capital and money weighs heavily on the democratic system. The system of consumer capitalism in recent decades has become adept at defusing, or indeed incorporating, any political aspirations and energies that might challenge it. Its principal historical antagonist, the industrial working class, has sharply diminished as a fraction of the population, and in part as a consequence of the transfer of much of the manufacturing economy to other continents. The working class has in any case become assimilated into the culture of contemporary capitalism through the universalization of consumer culture and through substantial measures of protection against the worst hazards of the market. The majority of the population of the West has had no reason to wish for the total overthrow of its system for many decades. But we now might wish to ask what political and cultural response might emerge as the performance and promise of this system begins to turn sour and leads to disappointment for large numbers of people. It seems pointless to think about revolution at this point in any conventional sense of that term, but one might nevertheless consider the latent desires and fears that may be evoked by this interruption of conventional expectations, by the realization that things may not be in the future as they have been in the recent past. Might there nevertheless be a revolutionary unconscious of some kind seeking its expression that's worth thinking about? We can identify several different strands in the reactions that have emerged to the current crisis. One conservative reaction reminds one of the Bourbons of the 1780s, that is, of those elements of the financial elite which think they've done nothing wrong in nearly wrecking the capitalist economy and see little need for change. Mitt Romney has represented that position in the American presidential election, where he did back off it to a degree. But that's not an uncontested view, even in circles of financial privilege, as readers of the Financial Times will have observed. Another current, coming also from the right, is that of a revived nationalism, taking the form in England of hostility to the European Union and to immigrants and strangers more generally. And this has its echoes all over Europe. This incipiently xenophobic position, in which outsiders are held responsible for present ills, is characteristic of situations of diminishing expectations. It involves a kind of magical thinking or fantasy, which is no more likely to bring improvements than reversions to nationalism did during the 1930s. The summer riots of 2012 in London were a different kind of response, which came from positions at the margins of the social order. Zizek, once again, has noted that these seem to have been protests virtually without a cause, pure enactments of consumerist desire and destruction, and embodying no political aim at all. In fact, this isn't entirely accurate, given the origins of the disturbance at the hands of the deaf, in the death at the hands of the police of a black man from a Tottenham estate, but it's true in regard to the larger disturbances. This reaction can be seen as a symptom of Bauman's liquid modernity, in which consumer desires have become dissociated from larger social meanings, and protest thus took the form of an unpremeditated, improvised, rolling riot, with scarcely any coherent sense of past or future, the unconscious at work indeed. Incidentally, the judicial system admitted severe punishments after the riots for what in other circumstances would have been regarded as minor offences against property, stealing gym shoes and so forth, trainers and so on, arguing that the context of riot made the offences worse. One could equally have argued from a psychoanalytic point of view that the psychology of crowd behaviour should have been a ground for mitigation rather than severity when only trivial thefts were concerned. Here, however, was the unconscious of the judicial system at work. Much more coherent and positive has been the response of movements such as Occupy, who seized opportunities to make dramatic symbolic protests, drawing in cultures and institutions such as the Church of England, which usually remain aloof from such issues. Hart and Negri have developed an argument influenced by Deleuze's concepts of desire and lines of flight and so on, that modern protest can constitute and assemble multitudes, what we would once have called masses, bypassing the clumsy mediations of old institutions like political parties. We can see from mobilisation, such as in the Arab Spring, that elements of mobility and spontaneity, aided by the technologies of social media, are now part of the contemporary scene of resistance. Their articulation with more enduring structures and cultures, however, remains difficult. Yet another response to the economic crisis in Britain has been represented just now by Lord Heseltine's intervention in the Government Commission report, in which he advocates the return of economic initiative to the great provincial cities of Britain through the diversion of investment capital from the control of the central state to municipal authorities. This has in fact been Heseltine's long-term political vision as the big government capitalist that he is. In this he achieved limited success in Liverpool and in London Docklands, but his cause was, as a whole, defeated. Heseltine holds in his political imagination, his political unconscious we could say, the memory of the great provincial entrepreneurs of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, and their city governments, such as those of Birmingham and Manchester, who built all those wonderful municipal buildings that they have in those places. Instead, what we've seen is the triumph of a centralised state, whose powers are located in London, allied to a financial capitalism with little commitment to actual production. A fourth strand of reaction manifests itself as a defence, often by now a rather weary one, of what remains of the welfare state. That's to say, of services delivered until the current drive to marketisation by government employees broadly committed to an ethos of public service. The ongoing transfer of these services to combinations of private sector providers, subsidised charities and quasi-autonomous agents of the central state aims to dissolve this collectivist system of provision and the egalitarian norms which sustain it. The projected future is of quasi-private services which provide for the majority, while a residue of public provision of a depleted and sometimes punitive kind is left for the poor. The decline of a universal conception of public services began as early as the Labour government at the end of the 1970s, when James Callaghan announced, in an unintended pun, that the party's over. Since then, through several governments, a war of attrition was going on, as successive waves of reform have borne down on these services. One of the costs of this long struggle has been the discouragement of creativity and innovation within them, although of course these two survive. A fifth response is that of the growing number of conservationists. Response to government plans, for example, to allow developers free scope to build over the countryside in pursuit of economic growth. Or by urban conservationists like those recently in Totnes, who repelled a proposal to bring a Costa coffee house to their town to compete with locally owned coffee shops. Or like the people in Cromer who objected to a planned supermarket on the edge of their town on grounds that it would bleed their town centre of life. I think the Cromer people actually lost. Although these might seem to be conservative causes, they nevertheless draw upon definite communities of value in their opposition to corporate power. Now, it's quite obvious that none of these currents of resistance and protest are in any conventional sense revolutionary. Nevertheless, in a time of crisis and of rupture with previous expectations, space opens up for different imaginaries and possibilities to be articulated. And of course, there are many more of these than I've time to mention. The political breakthrough that occurred in Britain in 1945, following the dismal experiences of the interwar period and the solidarities of the Second World War, drew together, so Paul Addison wrote in his book, The Road to 1945, many different currents of radical opinion. Although the Labour Party was the governmental deliverer of the reforms that were accomplished, it was not, for the most part, according to Paul Addison, their author. We should be looking at this point to encourage ideas for alternative futures, which draw on whatever reserves of unconscious desire that can be tapped, and hope that these may grow into a connected programme for change. To conclude, Ron Britton has argued that depressive and paranoid states of mind are each necessary for psychological development. He criticised an earlier Kleinian viewpoint which tended to idealise, sometimes in a moralising spirit, the depressive position, in which the self was meant to be motivated by reparative concern for its objects. This goal, pointed out Britton, carries with it a risk of complacency. If all objects, to generalise the idea of object-relatedness, such as cultures, traditions, environments, procedures, authorities, are supposed to be valued for themselves, what about their deficiencies and the possibilities they exclude? Britain has argued that periodic disruptions of the mind from the outside or from the other, with the paranoid schizoid anxieties this must bring with it, are a force for creativity and development, as well as a source of risk. He divides an algebraic formula to describe this, PSD, PS1, D1, etc., recasting the Kleinian oscillation between the paranoid schizoid and depressive positions as preferably taking the developmental form of a spiral. In political terms, this psychological model implies the necessity for conflict and antagonism if change is to occur. Bion, after all, wrote of catastrophic change, the dissolution of established structures of belief or ideology, and the exposure to the new possibilities to which this might lead as a creative development, potentially. While one should be aware of the risks that go with paranoid schizoid states of mind, and the splitting and destructiveness to which they can lead, we need also to be not too afraid of conflict. Britain is also emphatic about the value in psychological development of a reflective third position, which means the capacity to think about dyadic systems, whether of mutual dependence or antagonism, from the outside. Britain sees this in terms of the Oedipal situation and the recognition of three-person relationships which this demands of the child and its parents during development. Most of his thinking about these matters is drawn from his consulting room experience, but it has a wider social relevance too. The third position in cultural and political terms requires the symbolic containment of differences and conflicts, for example through procedures, the negotiation and conflict resolution, through media committed to representing different positions, and through the exploration of artists and scientists, and indeed social scientists, which can illuminate situations of blockage and conflict in new ways. One could and should be more combative in the pursuit of political argument. Why, for example, is the public sector so universally castigated for its alleged failings, while Britain's largely unsuccessful private sector is exempted from general criticism, while at the same time remaining committed to balance and objectivity in the negotiation of political struggle? We need to pursue a politics which recognises the value both of catastrophic change and of reparative containment and respect.